So my name's Anthony Osborne. I'm a third year Bachelor of Business Public Relations student. I'm the Education Officer for the Swinburne Student Union, and I'm a co-chair for the Student Representative Council. So I have put this together, and I do, correct me if I'm wrong, that this might be the first student presentation I've seen at the conference. I don't know if it's the first ever. Could be, could be. All right, let's see if I break a record. Oh. So just a bit of what we're going through today is I'm going to discuss the survey that I ran early this year, then go through the demographics, then we're breaking it down to the topics of that survey, a bit about lecture recordings, a bit about rubrics, a bit about exams, and then we're going to have a discussion. I'm hopefully going to get through all of this quickly because I want to have a bigger discussion with everyone. So let's get into it. So I'm going to do this here because, I can see it from there, perfect. So the survey was done during the mid-semester break for higher ed students, and it covered three topics of lecture recordings, rubrics, and exams. This came about because of ongoing discussions within the Learning Technology Forum around those three topics, although the exams was more to get feedback from students about the exams so that we can take it to assessments for improvement. The survey was done through Google Forms, with my personal preference to use Google Forms. So it was a mixture of quantitative and qualitative questions to get all those bits of different feedback. So all up, we got 161 responses through the mid-semester break, which is really great in my view. And so from that, I think 55% were female, 44% were male, and 1% identified as gender neutral. 80% were undergraduate, 16% postgrad, 4% PAVE, and most of the responses came from Hawthorne campus, followed by Seoul. And then within the cohort, it was broken down into faculties. However, there is a slight data error when you look at it, and this is actually attributed to Swinburne Online. I found when I looked through the data is that, one of these is a laser. Yes, that's a laser. The Department of Health, Science, Education and Social Services, which is a PAVE faculty, comes up as a big chunk of the pie there. Pretty much all of those responses came from Seoul undergraduate students. So there is this thing about people not knowing what faculty they are in. So we'll move on. So from the lecture recordings, we looked at how many people had their lectures recorded, and 91% of respondents said they had their lectures recorded, with 7% saying that they didn't. So from this, a small percentage said that, not small, but about 38% said all of their lectures were recorded, and 40% said most of them were recorded, while 5% said none were recorded. And from that, we also wanted to find out why, if the lectures were recorded, what did they watch them for, or how often did they watch it? 31% said sometimes they watch it, while 24% said they watch it all the time, and 18%, and this is the more interesting for me, was they only watched it for revision. That was from the quantitative sort of questions. So the qualitative questions are much more fun and interesting to read through, and I did try and pull out some of the more funny responses to put in here, and then I'll go into some more detail. So we did ask at least three questions, like why do people watch recordings, why do people not watch recordings, and what do they think are the advantages and disadvantages of recordings. So there was a lot of common themes that came out of why people watch recordings. So they watch it for revision, to catch up if they've missed something, particularly if they're sick or they've got work or something, and then for some, if they've got a clash in their lectures where they've got two lectures where there's no alternative. For why they don't watch recordings, this was a bit of interesting. Some of them were funny, like they're a bit too lazy to watch them. But at the same time, one of the more common themes, and this also pops up in the advantages and disadvantages, is that there seems to be poor audio quality or a lot of technical issues with black screens and the lecturers have forgotten to turn on the microphone, or you'll be surprised how often that one popped up. So apparently it happens a few times. And other sort of technical issues. There was also a bit of why people don't watch it is because, 2-hour-long lecture, you have to sit there for 2 hours, or if you're smart, you put it on 1.5 speed and get through it a little bit quicker. There was also apparently some issues with particular individual lectures, and I've sort of generalised these responses because I didn't want to individualise things, but some students identified issues with their lecturer in terms of how they engage through online. So some of the key reasons we actually got to why people want lectures recorded is around illness and disability, to re-go again over content that they're unsure of, because it's really easy to pause and rewind if you miss something you can't do to an actual lecturer when they're speaking up front, particularly if they go fast. Some also identify, they've got clashes with work, Centrelink, other things, and that it also helps to jog their memory. And that also carries over again into the sort of the advantages and disadvantages to the recordings of lecturers. One of the key things I actually pulled out, one of the disadvantages of to recordings is it's the same as the PowerPoint slides. And I'm probably going to be guilty of this as well. So there is some key learnings that to actually pull out of the responses around how we use lectures, how we use PowerPoint, and what we use lecture recordings for, and why students use lecture recordings for. From everyone who responded to the survey, unfortunately I didn't have the time to pull out those who said they had lectures, but everyone who responded, 90% of them said they wanted lectures to be recorded. This is also an issue that has popped up at the Student Representative Council, where I think it was more engineering students were from the engineering FSCC were calling for lectures to be recorded because they've got a fair few lectures that aren't recorded. So we'll move on to this lovely thing known as rubrics. Some of the key things here were to find out how many students knew about rubrics and if their rubrics are easy to understand. So this can actually help us bring it back to the right forums and actually delve into it, look into it, and see what we can do to improve it. So roughly 44% said they've heard of rubrics, 8% haven't, 8% weren't sure, and the rest were either sometimes or they've occasionally heard of it. From the question of are their rubrics easy to understand, and I'll go in a bit more detail in just a second about this, 18% said all of their rubrics were easy to understand. That is something of interesting to note, because this is what students have been assessed on, this is what we as students have to use to base our assignments around, and if they're all not, clear and easy to understand, then we get into slight problems there. But 67% said some of their rubrics were easy to understand, while only 2% said none were. Although there's a large percentage that weren't sure if their rubrics were easy to understand. So the general feedback from rubrics, this is a mix of the positives and the negatives, and I tried to keep a bit of a balance between the two, they're very helpful for giving guidance, but the problem is they're not always accessible, particularly when they're put on Blackboard, because I'm about to say every unit sticks their rubrics in a different place, and you've got to sometimes go hunting for the rubrics depending on what the Blackboard looks like. The other issues were that the criteria can be a bit vague, and sometimes they were subjective criteria, like there's a difference between good understanding of knowledge and some understanding of knowledge. What's the difference there, and how do you quantify that? There was also, and this is predominantly came from the Swinburne Online students, was there seems to be a bit of backlash against holistic rubrics. I think within like 20 responses that were about holistic rubrics, only one was positive, the rest were quite negative about them. So that's something to consider if we're using holistic rubrics, is how they use it and how it's fair for students if they're doing well, or HD level, for example, across most fields, but get pulled down to a P because one field was at a pass level. Rubrics can be useful to benchmark, and they're actually great for helping students guide how to write their assignments and what to include in their assignments, but there's still a lot of room for improvement, particularly around the more subjective parts of rubrics. So moving on to exams, just some general stuff around, how many people had exams where they had their exams. So it was a mix between Etihad and Swinburne and at Etihad Stadium. The main reason I was looking for exams was from the Office of Learning and Teaching conference that I went to earlier this year, where there's presentations around e-exams. So I was trying to get some feedback around thoughts on electronic exams. But there was also questions about was the content in the exam what was covered in the unit, for which the responses were 25% said all of their exam content was in the, all the exam content was covered in the unit, while 36% said that most of the content was there. Although that would change if you remove those who said they did not have exams. So from that, we were looking for electronic exams, because this was a bit of a discussion that I wanted to have with the university and around the university, is around moving away from paper-based exams or going forward. Personally, I'd also like to see, moving away from exams in general, but that's a completely different question. In that, it was roughly on a pie chart, it was in thirds really, I would say, if those who want to see move to computers, those who wouldn't, and those who weren't sure. So it's still an interesting discussion to have from that student perspective, but it's also something you have to look at from the research and sort of pedagogical side of what do we get out of using electronic exams. But there were thoughts on exams around particularly awkward and difficult phrasing of questions, particularly if I'm going to say the English standard or the question isn't always the best, and I've had that experience firsthand as well. They're great for units that rely on memory for content, but not so great for units where you're just redoing your major assignment in an exam format. There was also issues with, particularly for online students, where the exams are located and travel, but there's also a call for more practice papers for exams. And so from there, I'm going to ask, are there any questions, or let's start a discussion.
Excellent research and very useful to know. Is it possible to get access to the more in-depth information that you have? I'm
currently putting together a written report of it all, amongst all my study time as well. So unfortunately studies do take priority, so the report has taken a bit longer to do what it is, but once I get the report done, it will be made publicly available, and I can send a link to Liz and Mike, which they can share around to staff that have interest in it. Because the other point was I want to bring this stuff back to the Learning Technology Forum, so that we can discuss it more and actually have a bit of a more basis to have those discussions in that forum, because I'm the only student in a room full of academics and university staff. So it's good to have that research backup to, back up my arguments about why we need these sort of things. Any other questions? Yes? Barbara? Hold on, just wait for the mic.
You mentioned that 90% of the students wanted lectures recorded. Did you tell us how many actually watched lectures that were recorded?
I did mention it from the percentage-wise. Do you watch them? It was one of the early things, so... Actually, I'll just go back. That's easier and better because it's colour-coded. There we go. So this is the paragraph for those who responded about why, if they watched the lecture recording. So 24% said that they watch them all the time. 31% said sometimes, 18% for revision, 18% for occasionally, and a small percentage said never. I'm not sure if there's more. Is there more to the question, or? No, that was it. Yep. Mark, just wait for the mic.
So a follow-up. That's a follow-up question from that one. When I go on Blackboard and look and see, or on Echo and see who's watched the lectures that have been recorded from my classes, the numbers look a bit different to that. So I wonder how much of this is what I actually like to do rather than what I actually do. Would you give us a comment on that, Anthony?
Look, I'll also say from my experience, I will say I like to watch the lecture recordings, but I don't do it all the time. But it's one of those things with self-identification is you may sometimes always bump it up by accident or not. But that said, it's while that might be the case, there are also multiple other reasons why lecture recordings are wanted for some students. For example, mentioned those who had lecture clashes, those who had work or Centrelink because they have to work, or some other commitment, or sick and that stops them getting to the lecture. The only way they can engage with it is to watch the lecture recording, provided that it's not exactly the same as what's on the PowerPoint slide.
I have two questions here. First, given Swinburne has so many students, and this project is actually driven or initiated by the student union, I would have thought this is the excellent opportunity for the students to raise their voice, they raise their concern, tell us what they want. But yet, if we look at your survey respondents, you only got 180. In my view, it's a bit of disappointing. Maybe you guys could think about how to increase the rate of respondents so that it's really reflecting the whole body of Swinburne students. So there's a suggestion. The other thing, you want to respond first?
Can I just respond to that one quickly? As I mentioned, it was done during the mid-semester, or not the mid-semester, but the winter break. So it's a harder time to engage with particularly higher ed students in that period because people go away for holidays, don't want to engage with anything to do with the university. But also it is one of those things that while we're close to students on the ground, we don't have the same reach as what Swinburne Student Comms have. So we sent the survey out to our membership of the Student Union, which is roughly 2,200, plus put it on Stalker Space and a few other locations to get responses. And it was one of those things, I was offering up prizes for people to complete it, and that is also why a lot of people completed it. But it'd probably be one of those things, we'll get a lot more responses if it was done during the actual semester than it would be if it was in a period of break.
So a suggestion would be you could have follow-up. So those have not yet responded, they can do it. My other question is really related to the exams. I believe that assessment is still the driving force for students' learning. You said, okay, some students don't like exams. What do they really want? How do they think we should assess them?
This is something I've had more discussions with, because one thing I like to do is go out and chat to students, and I manage to bring up all the most random and weirdest conversations around this, and this stuff comes up as well. It depends, the short answer is it depends on the subject, and the sort of relevance to the subject. So some units an exam works quite well for, others you can be sitting there like, why is this on an exam? And I've had, from my own personal experience, I've had an exam where one of the exam assessments was exactly the same as the assessment we were doing for the entire 12 weeks. There's a difference between doing something over 12 weeks and then trying to do the same thing in 3 hours when the thing you're doing over 12 weeks was a group assessment. So I think the takeaway from there is probably making exam content more relevant and more different to what you're already assessed.
Thank you, and you did a thought-provoking presentation, and also you timed and shared your question time yourself, so that was magnificent. That's fantastic.